So here we go, number 2 in the AQA Unit 2 exam paper series of videos. And I thought before we just get started in earnest that it might just be worth us looking at the paper to familiarise ourselves with the paper and just to give you one or two ideas from my thoughts about how to structure the way in which you think about answering this paper. So this is video 2, and let's start with the front page to the exam paper. And you'll recall that we're working on the January 2011 paper. So make sure you've got that in front of you so as you can look and follow along as we go. Now, I think the first thing to say about most of the AQA papers is that they have a system whereby the time pretty much matches the marks. You can see here that the time allowed for this paper is 90 minutes. And you'll notice that the total's maximum mark for this paper is 94 marks. So what I mean, and why I make a point of looking at those two things, is that I tell my students absolutely religiously, this means that you've got 1 minute per mark. So if a question is worth 7 marks, you need to spend 7 minutes on it. Now that seems absolutely obvious, but it's so easy to allow the paper to run away with you. The grade boundaries in AQA are so narrow that if you just fail to, if you accumulate 1 extra minute per question throughout the paper, you probably will not be able to answer the last 2 questions. And that means that you are automatically putting your grade in jeopardy. So the trick and the tactic that I tell all of my students to use is that to have a stopwatch, to have a clock, to have your watch on the desk, and that the moment, if it's a 7-minute question, know when you start. The moment that the 7th minute is up, stop writing on that question and move on to the next one. It's the 80-20 rule. You'll get the majority of your marks in the first 80% of time that you spend on that question. The last 2 or 3 minutes that might even be beyond the 7 minutes that you're allowed will only be added next to no extra value at all. So 1 minute equals 1 mark in this paper, and make sure that you stick to it religiously. The only other thing really to say from the, well, there are a couple of things actually, but one of the next major thing to say is that you've got to answer 2 scenarios. So everybody has to do crime, which is scenario A. And we're going to look at each of these in a minute. So everybody has to do crime, which is scenario A, and then you get to choose between B or C. And B is tort and C is contract. So you have to do 2 scenarios, and we'll look at them in a moment. The other thing to say here is that in questions 5, 8 and 15, and question 5 is in criminal, 8 is in tort and 15 is in contract, you will be awarded up to 2 marks for assessment objective 3, AO3, which is about your ability to use good English. Now I always say to my students, those are 2 marks, and it's more in later papers, that you should always score the maximum on. Please don't lose marks for something that you should just be gaining almost immediately. So that's pretty much the only thing that you really need to know, I think, to be fair. We'll do some videos later on about UMS marks and how UMS marks are calculated, and the way in which you can tactically look at all 4 papers to make sure that you get your best possible mark overall. But that's all I wanted to say, really. From the front of the paper, you've got 90 minutes to complete it. That works out at roughly around about 45 minutes per scenario. So you'll have 45 minutes on crime, and you'll have 45 minutes on either tort or contract. But that definitely works out at 1 minute per mark, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. So let's have a look at scenario 1. And scenario 1 is criminal liability. Everybody answers this, so you will have to do criminal. And you'll see that it's made up very clearly. You've got 47 marks and you've got 45 minutes. Okay, so the moment that you get here, this is a 7-mark question, you should spend 7 minutes on it. Again, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, don't count the AO2, 5 minutes and 5 minutes, okay? You will notice that in each of the scenarios in Unit 2 exams, you have got here the scenario itself. This is the sort of small story upon which everything else is based. You then have a bit of a clue. And frequently I tell my students to start by reading this bit here before they read the scenario. Because what this tells us is that the examiner is talking about actus reus and particularly about acts and omissions. He also says that he's talking about mens rea and they've mentioned strict liability at the end. So even before you've looked at the questions, the examiner is sort of signposting the AO1 predominant questions, the descriptive questions that they want you to talk about. And if you look here in question 1, you can see that the question's about an omission. Question 2, the question's about strict liability. So I frequently tell my students to make sure that they read this bit first, the clue. And sometimes that can give you a clue as to what they're looking for in a scenario. AQA will then say to you very clearly that they want you to refer to the scenario when answering the remaining questions. So 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 are all relating to this small scenario account here. In this case, 3, 4 and 5 are essentially proper substantive problem questions. 6 and 7 are going to be about the courts. They are still, they still relate to the scenario, but mainly they're back to being descriptive. The application part is much, much shorter. And that structured format is repeated in each of the other sections. So if we look at tort, which is section B, and my guys do criminal and tort, you'll see that there's the scenario. You'll see there's the AQA clue. And they say here, duty of care, breach of duty and damage. Well, that's a bit of a no-brainer because that doesn't really give you too much. But straight away, you've got care that they're asking you about here. And then you've got breach here. So you've got breach, and that's question 9. Once again, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes. Okay, 7 marks equals 7 minutes. You've got 3 questions here, though. You've got your damage. So you've got 3 descriptive questions. 8, 9 and 10 are descriptive questions. Then the final 4 questions here refer to, these are the substantive questions, and they refer to the scenario. You've got 2 that are proper problem questions. And then you've got 2 that are the courts, once again. And they are going to have more description than they are going to have scenario-related answer. And I'm going to answer each of these for you over the course of the series of videos. And then finally, you've got introduction to contract. Exactly the same thing. You've got the clue. And here you've got offer and acceptance and invitation to treat. There you go. That's your first question. You've then got conduct and acceptance. And you've got consideration. We've got consideration here too. So AQA are trying to help you out in terms of just calming you down and letting you know what the paper's going to contain. You've got your scenario. And your scenario then relates to questions 18 and 19. These are your substantive questions. And then finally, you've got your 2 court questions. Now, I'm absolutely certain that your teachers will have gone over that exactly the same way for you, but I just think that it's very, very useful. So as when we start to talk about the exam papers specifically, then that we know precisely what it is that we're talking about. So in what we're going to start by doing is we're going to start by jumping ahead in the next video and start to look at some substantive question and answer techniques.